Welcome back, fellow gamers. I hope you didn't miss me yesterday. That was one of the rare pauses we have had. After 50 days and 54 videos, I had to go missing on Sunday because I was busy robbing a bank. So now that the heist has been successful, we can go back to talk about WoW, to talk about the game, and something interesting and cool to go over. Because with 9.1.5 getting closer and closer and 9.1 being longer and longer, people are getting bored. They're not really playing as much. If they're even playing, they want to look at other things. Maybe they get interested in other specs, in other classes. They see changes, balance tuning. Perhaps they see the ability to play multiple covenants. So they get interested in other classes, other specs. So this is where we come in with some advice, some of the picks you might go for, and based on what you might be interested in. As I say every time, people choose what to play for different reasons. So we're going to go over the specs and what specs you might choose based on what might interest you. For example, if you're interested in a popular spec, you're tired of getting benched, you're tired of getting declined in Mythic Plus, so all you care about now is looking at a popular spec. Maybe instead you want to look at a spec that has a lot of diversity, a lot of variety, because in 9.1.5 you will be able to swap to multiple covenants. Why would you want to play a spec that has been playing with the same covenant since the release of the expansion and has no plans of even changing that once 9.1.5 comes close? You want a spec that can play 3 different covenants, maybe even 4 if you're playing a class with multiple specs of the same role, right? So that's what you might be interested in. Perhaps you might be interested in the type of damage they do. Maybe you're bored, you're tired of doing single target and seeing all these other turbo Mongo AoE cleave specs passing you in damage every single time, and now it's you who want to do the AoE damage and you're interested in that. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you feel like AoE damage is not important enough. It's just bait. It's not really what matters. What you care about is single target, so you want a spec that does good single target. Perhaps you just want a jack of all trades that can do sort of everything. So this is where we come in. This is where the video comes in, and we're going to go over what any of these specs and how any of these specs are going to function for you to choose from, starting from the melee DPS, because I rolled the dice and the melee side came up. So that's what we are starting with. Let's start by looking at the choice if you wanted a popular pick. If you are someone looking for a spec that is certain to be wanted. So your case in question is less about, I want to have fun, I want to enjoy a spec, I want to try out a spec that does something different than my spec, etc, etc. Your case is, I have been benched 1 too many times in the raid, or I keep getting declined 1 too many times in Mythic Plus. I just don't feel like my spec is wanted. So that's my main goal for the next patch, to pick a spec that I know at least is going to be considered way more than my current spec. Maybe you're playing survival, maybe you're playing feral, you're playing ret, maybe you're a range DPS who wants to respec, so you're playing something like Destruction Warlock, you're playing Beast Mastery Hunter, Arcane Mage, or maybe you're a Mistweaver Monk or a Prot Warrior, and you just want a spec that you know is going to be considered more. For that type of choice for the melee DPS, the easier and simpler picks at the moment are Havoc, Demon Hunter, and Warrior. In this case, for the moment, it's Arms Warrior. So these are the most popular specs if you're looking at the PvE content together. When it comes to raids, it's Arms Warriors at the top and then Havoc. And when you're looking at Mythic Plus, it's Havoc at the top and then Arms Warriors. So those are the 2 simplest and safest choices for you. If you were focusing a little bit more in raids, so you're like, I don't care about Mythic Plus, I'm gonna get my Keystone Master every time with my guildies, I'm gonna do maybe a 17, maybe some 18s, but I don't need to have that much of a focus on Mythic Plus because I care more about the raid, then you can go over to Rogues a little bit. They are very diverse in all 3 of the specs and they are pretty competent and very good in raid encounters. If you were the opposite, if you're like, I'm not really gonna progress too much in raid encounters, you know, I'm gonna be doing heroic, maybe I'm gonna be doing mythic raiding the first few bosses, or maybe I'm in a guild that progresses pretty slowly, so they're not too serious with picking meta specs in raid. What I am more interested in is Mythic Plus, so you don't have to focus that much in raiding. Then on top of Havoc and Arms, you could also go for Windwalker, which is doing very, very well in Mythic Plus. Not as much in raids, which is why you would want to focus on something like Windwalker if you were going with more of a Mythic Plus focus. What if instead your choice of picking a new spec or a new class as a whole was based on the diversity, based on the choices, based on the options. So, for example, you are playing a spec that has been playing with the same talent setup, playing with the same covenant since the release of the expansion, has been playing with the same legendary since the release of the expansion, and you're like, enough, okay, enough, I want to play something different. You know, I've been playing Guardian Druid, Night Fae with a trash legendary since the first day, since the first week or whatever of the expansion, and it doesn't even look like it's gonna change in 9.1.5, it's gonna be the exact same. I have been playing Restoration Shaman, I am Necrolord, I am playing with the Riptide legendary in Red Encounters, and it's gonna be like this again. I have been playing Marksmanship, I have been Night Fae with the Aim Shot legendary, the Serpent Stalkers, since the release of the expansion. I just want to try something new. I just want to have the multiple options, because now in 9.1.5, when you can finally spec into multiple covenants whenever you want, I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to have choices based on what I want to do, Mythic Plus, raids, PvP, single target, multi-target, whatever. Since that option is available, I would rather play a spec that allows me, or a class that allows me to choose like that, with that type of freedom. So when it comes to the melee DPS, one of the cool picks for this type of choice would be a rogue. Again, rogues have the advantage because they have 3 specs, so it's going to be easier for you to find diversity if you play a class with multiple specs. Because at the moment, Subtlety Rogue is playing Ventir, while Outlaw Rogue is playing Necrolord, and Assassination Rogue can play either. Both Necrolord and Ventir can be played, so you would have the options not just of 3 different specs, but also 2 different covenants. Not to mention Kyrian is also playable and pretty good for Outlaw in Mythic Plus as well. You would have pretty good options if you're playing a rogue with your choices, as opposed, for example, to something like Death Knight. You know, Death Knight is one of the cases where both of the DPS specs have been Necrolord since the start of the expansion, where both of the DPS specs have used the same couple of legendaries since the start of the expansion, and coming into 9.1.5, that doesn't look like being able to play multiple covenants is going to open up a lot of choices and opportunities for them. Frost DK is more likely to do so than Unholy, but even then, they seem very stationary, very stuck to what they started the expansion with compared to something like Rogue. Another example, if you wanted diversity outside of Rogues, you have Warriors. Arms Warrior can play Kyrian in Mythic Plus, for example. They can play Night Fae in Red Encounters. You have Fury Warrior that is already playing Night Fae and Kyrian in Mythic Plus, but can also play Ventir in Red Encounters. So you also have that option. In general, if you're looking at specs that are gonna give you more diversity and more options when looking at the specs to play, rogues are a good pick, warriors are a good pick. You have enhancement, which is also a good pick. They can play 3 at the moment, 3 different covenants, basically all except Necrolord are all pretty good for enhancement. And then you have specs that are more stuck to their original choices. They don't seem to have too much diversity coming in for the next patch, like the DK specs, like Havoc, Demon Hunter is also very stuck in Night Fae, as well as Feral Druid, which is very, very monothematic, especially since the Covenant-specific legendary for Night Fae has been released. They are completely rooted in that option, that combo of legendary and Covenant choice of Night Fae. So that would be how it would look like if you were looking at a spec to play based on how diverse their picks, their options could be, what they could come up with. If you wanted to try something new every week, something different every week, then those will be the overall choices. What about the damage now? You don't care about how popular the spec is. You have a Mythic Plus team, you have a raiding team you can play with, you already know you're gonna have a spot, so you don't really need to care about picking a hipster spec that nobody wants. What about the Covenant choice? You don't really care about the choice, you know, you have 2 other alts to play. If you want diversity, if you want to try something new, you can just play other characters. You don't feel like you need different choices and diversity within the same character. What you care about instead is the way they do damage. How do they do damage? In which style? Is it AoE? Is it single target? Is it focused on a very particular thing and really bad at all the rest? Or is it just slightly better while still being pretty competent in the other areas, etc., etc.? when you look at this, we have, first of all, the picks, the options and the choices you can have if you want to go for extremes. If you had to split your 100 points of damage, these choices would have 90 points in one of the options. For example, Windwalker. If you wanted to go for full-on AoE damage, then Windwalker would be your pick. Windwalker right now has the weakest single target DPS of all the melee, especially after they rerolled to Necrolord. So technically true, in 9.1.5 they could be able to go back to Kyrian and slightly strengthen their single target again, but it would still be on the very low end. So Windwalker is the pick you go for when it looks like you want AoE. In raid encounters, you will be able to top the meters when you're fighting a boss fight with a lot of AoE. So if you're fighting right now, for example, if you're fighting Soul Render, if you're fighting Painsmith, if you're fighting Kel'Thuzad, or even Fate Scribe, you will have the option, you will be expected, you will have the possibility to top the meters because of your superior AoE. The same goes for Mythic Plus. You're gonna be picked as a Windwalker Monk because of your superior AoE. Other examples in this all or nothing mentality, you have Assassination Rogue, you have Enhancement Shaman, and you have Feral Druid. These, on the other hand, are the specs that are focused on single target and not on AoE. They are amongst the better performing single target specs, in particular Feral Druid. Feral Druid has been the standout, strongest. Basically, Feral Druid is the equal and opposite of Windwalker. You will be able to have very, very strong single target. You will be expected, you will be wanted whenever there is single target needed. You are going to be very strong. So is Assassination. And then partially Enhancement. Enhancement is definitely the weaker of the bunch. It is pretty unfortunate. They do focus a lot on single target, but their results are not as good. It feels kind of bad. You are only bailed out by the fact that you have Wind Fury Totem. That's pretty much it. And then you have other specs that, it might be an oxymoron, but you have specs that specify in not specifying in anything. So you have specs that are decent at everything they do. 1 target, 3 targets, 5 targets, or maybe 10 targets. They're gonna be doing fine. They're not gonna be the best at that, and they're not gonna be the worst at that. So you can always guarantee that if you pick that spec, you're gonna be fine. You're never gonna be given a pat on the back. You're never gonna be hearing comments about people being surprised about your top damage, because it's not gonna be you. If it's single target, it's not gonna be you. If it's AoE, it's not gonna be you. But you can at least guarantee that you will be able to do fine in all the different damage profiles. In this camp, in this group, you have Havoc, Demon Hunter, you have Unholy and Frost, Death Knight, and then you have Outlaw, Rogue. So these specs don't have too much of a niche. Havoc, Demon Hunter, for example, ever since they got pseudo reworked with their talents, they do much, much, much stronger single target than they did before. Before, they had the place of Windwalker, of the weakest of the single target specs. Now they are doing much better. At the same time, they have been passed in AoE by a multitude of specs. So they're not kings of AoE anymore. So they're going to be in the middle. They're going to be doing fine in the middle. Same can be said for Unholy DK. You know, back in the day, at the start of the expansion, Unholy was the spec with the super high AoE. Now it's not as strong, but at the same time it's still competitive, it's still decent. Same goes for the single target. Frost can be the same. So those would be good choices, good options if you wanted to be sure that you can pull your weight in every type of activity or damage profile, but never really expected to be the strongest in either of these things. Now that you have looked at the possible different options you might want to have, to go for a recap of these specs, we start alphabetically with Arms Warrior, because Arms Warrior is the pick we said is going to be very good if you wanted to go for popularity and for meta. Both in Raid Encounters and in Mythic Plus, they are doing just fine. At the same time, they also have some decent options in Covenants, because both Nightfey and Kyrian are pretty good, so you might have different options in 9.1.5 on how to play the spec. Their damage profile is also very good, balanced, middle of the pack type of deal. You have the options to do pretty high damage in single target, not as much in AoE, but you can still pull your weight, so it's also pretty good if you wanted to go for that. Then you have Assassination Rogue. Assassination Rogue in the meta is not one of the picks, it's not one of the choices because of their lack of presence in Mythic Plus. So it's not a strong pick if you were looking at popularity. If you were looking at the variety of their picks, they are also pretty varied, even more than Warrior. They can go for both Necrolord and Ventir, so you might have the options there. Their damage profile is very specific. If you did care about that type of specialty, then Assassination is very, very focused on single target, and you will be expected, you will be doing very well in single target if you're playing Assassination, at the cost of being very, very weak in AoE. Then you have Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman does suffer from the popularity side of things because it's not very popular. It is quite unpopular, so it's definitely not one of the choices for you if you were looking for a safe spec to play. The Covenant choices are right now amongst the best options for the melee DPS because they have Kyrian, Ventir, and Nightfade that are all playable for enhancement, and their damage profile is more leaning towards heavier single target than quite balanced across the board. Feral Druid does follow similarly to enhancement, but basically just stronger. They are not very popular like enhancement, but slightly more. Their choice, their diversity is also pretty non-existent. They are all gonna be Night Fae playing with the same, basically, legendary. The payoff is that you're a very, very specific, very, very funneled single target spec. That's gonna be your niche, your specialty. Frost Death Knight's popularity is also pretty lacking. It's not that popular. The Covenant choice is also pretty stuck in Necrolord, and their damage profile is also more average. They don't have a very strong focus on single target. They have good options when it comes to burst AoE, but they are still beaten by a group of other specs. Then you have the Fury Warrior option. Fury is not popular, as popular at the very least as Arms. They do have multiple options with their Covenants. Night Fae, Kyrian, and Ventir are also playable for Fury Warrior. Their damage profile is more spread. They are not a super focused spec in single target or in AoE, so you have that option as a warrior. Then you have Havoc, Demon Hunter, which is very stuck when it comes to Covenant choice, to diversity. It's very stuck with Night Fae. They are, however, very popular, so for the popularity pick, Havoc is the best choice. They also have a very spread, a very even damage profile in all different types of activities and types of damage they can do. They are very, very balanced. Another pretty balanced spec is Outlaw, which is also pretty popular. Not as much in raids, way more in Mythic Plus. The Covenant choice is also pretty spread. They can go Necrolord, which is what they are, but they can also play as Kyrian and even Ventir. Their damage profile is way more spread. Outlaw used to be an AoE machine, and the only reason why you wanted an Outlaw Rogue with you was their AoE. Now they are much more balanced. Their AoE is much weaker comparatively to before, but their single target is much stronger. Then we have Red Paladin. Red Paladin is not very popular. It is very popular actually overall across all levels of keys and raids, not at the higher level. So if you cared about that level, they're not very popular. Their Covenant, diversity, and pick options are pretty narrow in Kyrian. Perhaps Ventir with Ashen Hallow for red might be a thing in 9.1.5. It's still just gonna be those two Covenants. Their damage profile is pretty spread. The burst is mostly what puts them on a niche. Their single target burst and their AoE burst in the middle, they're pretty soft. They're not very strong. Then you have the last of the rogue specs, which is Subtlety. Subtlety is pretty popular in Raid Encounters and in Mythic Plus. They are the most funneling of the rogue specs because they are playing basically exclusively Ventir, so they have the least diversity amongst the rogue specs, and their damage profile is also pretty varied. They do have very, very strong single target, and they have passable, they have average AoE. It's not as bad as it used to be before, now that they have access to Black Powder, their AoE finisher. Then you have Survival. Survival, of course, is the weakest of all of these specs when it comes to popularity, when it comes to meta, when it comes to choices. It's the one that's played the least. When it comes to their options in their Covenants, they are also mostly stuck within Kyrian, so they don't have too many options in there as well. At the very least, their damage profile is a little bit more spread. It is still leaning way more towards single target. Their options when it comes to burst AoE, when it comes to quick and efficient AoE is still pretty poor. But the main problem, the main risk you would run for Survival is mainly just the popularity part. Then we have Unholy. Unholy has remained when it was the king of popularity in 9.0. Now it has lost quite a bit. It is still pretty popular. It is still pretty decent. People are not going to treat you like a leper if you're playing Unholy DK. Their Covenant choice, however, is much on rails because it's just Necrolord. Their picks are pretty stuck when it comes to that. Their damage profile has gotten way more varied, way more average and balanced compared to before. And lastly, you have Windwalker. Windwalker is very popular in Mythic Plus. It is decently popular in Red Encounters. The Covenant choices and their variety is very, very narrow. They are also mostly Necrolord, some Room, some leftover Kyrian monks are there as well, but the majority is still Necro. Their damage profile is extremely unbalanced because they are very, very, very into AoE and much, much less into single target. So this would be the recap of all of the melee DPS specs when you are looking at choosing one of these specs for 9.1.5, depending on whether or not you are looking for a popular spec, whether or not you're looking for a spec that has diverse and varied options, whether or not you're interested in the type of damage that they can do. This is what we have for melee DPS. So for now, this is all we have. We might have some changes, for example, in balance tuning that Blizzard is planning to add. So things might change in the future. They will certainly change if you count the 9.1.5 balance tuning and the likely 9.2 balance tuning that will happen. Some of these things might change. But for now, this is the current situation of the melee DPS specs. Now, with this being done, we can leave. We can stop. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to support the channel, leave a like, comment down below and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me guys know if you already started thinking about playing a different spec in 9.1.5 and in the near future, or if you're just planning to stick to your main. And if you're indeed planning on playing a different character, what would be the reason? Is it the popularity? Is it the diversity and the choices? Is it the damage they can do? Which of the reasons brought you to look elsewhere? Thank you guys. Anyways, see you guys soon. And in the meantime, 31 degrees. Why? Why do we need it in September? Please stop.